Hello, I'm Professor Rob McLaughlin, Director of the Australian Centre for the Study of Armed Conflict and Society at the University of New South Wales campus at the Australian Defence Force Academy in Canberra. Welcome to this episode of the Australian Naval History podcast series. It is a production of the Naval Studies Group at the University of New South Wales, Canberra, in partnership with the Australian Naval Institute, the Naval Historical Society, the Submarine Institute of Australia, and the Sea Power Centre Australia. In the last episode, we talked about how Navy's health services had developed from their colonial predecessors up until the end of World War II. In this episode, we'll talk about how Navy's health services have developed since World War II. Once again, I'm joined by Commodore Mick Dowsett, who served as a permanent Navy dental officer for over 30 years and as Director General Navy Health Services before retiring in 1997. Mike has written extensively about the early history of the RAN Health Services. We're also joined again by Commander Neil Westphalen, who served as a permanent Navy medical officer for 29 years before transferring to the Reserve in 2016. He has also written extensively on the Navy Health Services. Welcome back. Mike, what were the challenges for the Navy's health services in this period immediately following the Second World War?
Well, I think immediately following, the Navy as a whole reverted back to its reliance for guidance from the Royal Navy, and this was reflected in health services as well. An example, the decision to purchase 2 aircraft carriers from Britain saw the need to have our own expertise in aviation medicine. The creation of a diving branch needed our capability in underwater medicine. We built ships based on British designs, and they included pre-wetting systems to cope with potential nuclear fallout. And so health staff had to be abreast of all those advances in military medicine. The Korean War, I think it was our first test following World War II, but again, we were part of a larger British force and supported medically by British military hospitals in Hong Kong and Singapore. The next major change was the involvement in the nuclear tests in the Montebello Islands. Fortunately, we had a medical officer who had been recently recruited from the UK, Commander Jim Lloyd, later became a Rear Admiral, but he developed, mainly as a result of his own interest, expertise in nuclear medicine, the medical aspects of nuclear warfare. And he really pioneered that. Operational support from away from our shores was another factor where we started to become a bit independent. And that involved establishing a base at Manus Island on a smaller scale in the 50s, but by 1974, the Navy had a 32-bed general ward hospital operating theatre and medical, dental and nursing staff to support a small naval involvement, but also the local community. Vietnam War was another area where we were primarily supported by the United States Navy. And so we didn't need our own military expertise and backup to support that engagement. Things changed a bit when the British forces were withdrawn from east of Suez in 1971, and that meant a naval involvement far away from our shores in Singapore, part of a tri-service, tri-national force, ANZAC force, and we contributed a small share of medical officers, dental officers and nursing officers and sailors until that Australian withdrawal in 1974. Interspersed, of course, in all that were the tragedies of the Melbourne Voyager collision and later the Melbourne Evans collision, which all had medical input. Navy's response to Cyclone Tracy, the gassing incident aboard HMAS Storwit in 1996, and the Westralia fire, and also the response to the tsunami in Aceh with the tragic loss of a Sea King helo.
So, Neil, Mike has talked about the development of some new types of naval medicine, aviation, diving, etc. Can you talk about the development of Navy's aviation medicine capability?
Well, thanks, Rob. Well, the institution of the Fleet Air Arm in 1948 led to the development of a aviation medicine facility next to the sick quarters at Albatross, which was similar but on a much smaller scale to what the Air Force had down at Point Cook. We used it to provide training to the aviators on the physiological hazards associated with flying. This capability was introduced by the then commander, later Rear Admiral Robert Mumbles Copeland's, who was another RN import. The facility closed with the cessation of fixed-wing aviation in the mid-80s, and there was a bit of a hiatus for about 10 years until selected Navy medical officers began civilian diploma level education in aviation medicine at Farnborough in the UK, which continues to this day. This restored a pool of aviation medicine expertise, not only to support Navy aircrew on the clinical side and Commander Fleet Air Arm on the policy side, but it also helps make ADF aviation medicine truly joint.
In fact, butting in there, Neil, there are 2 naval medical officers actually completed full pilot training.
That's right. One of whom was later Commodore Michael Flynn. But it's which is good from an aviation support capability, but it's also important with respect to maritime rotary wing aeromedical evacuation, which has become even more important in recent years with the LHDs.
Mike, talk about the underwater medicine capability.
Yeah, I think the Navy's involvement in underwater medicine is largely unsung and unknown. But when the Navy formed a clearance diving branch in 1951, again, it was Royal Navy practice we followed, not only in equipment, but also in the medical examination of potential divers. But in Australia, at least one diver every fortnight in the 1950s lost consciousness during diving without any understanding as to why, and most of those cases were not reported. The then DG, Admiral Lionel Lockwood, convinced a reserve specialist, an anaesthetist, Rex Gray, to transfer to full-time service and to specialise in underwater medicine. In fact, in 1963, in the very first day of his posting to the diving school at Rushcutter, a compressed air diver undergoing free ascent training suffered an air embolism. Gray entered the recompression chamber with him, but was unable to revive him. Later, 2 CDs failed to surface during a night dive in Jervis Bay, and that time RAN divers on oxygen breathing sets lost consciousness at the rate of about 1 per week, with the diver being resuscitated pretty quickly and the incident unreported. However, experiments at the newly established School of Underwater Medicine using divers as test subjects disclosed that the problem was a flaw in the carbon dioxide absorbance system in the sets that were in use. And that research allowed the fledgling School of Underwater Medicine to gain international expertise in the understanding of oxygen syncope. The school later moved to Penguin, where it developed an international reputation not only in the treatment of decompression sickness, but an authority on dangerous marine animals, and it became the Australian reference centre for civilian divers who got the bends not only in Australian waters but in the Southwest Pacific. And from 1968, regional navies began sending their medical officers to Penguin for training. However, in the 70s, the support from Navy officers seemed to wane, budgetary support declined, and with that, a gap developed. The gap in that capability is recognised in 1982, and to regain expertise, we obtained the services of 2 medical officers in the Royal Navy, one of which had experience in submarine escape techniques. And from then on, we developed expertise in mixed gas capability, which was again recognised in the region.
Neil, we've talked about the aviation, we've talked about the diving branch, now something quite close to my heart. How about the submarine branch and its medicine?
Well, I guess the scope of the School of Underwater Medicine expanded tremendously with the introduction of the Oberon-class submarines from the late 1960s, because we had to do two things. One was to look at medical suitability for submarine service, and we also had to develop a submarine escape and rescue capability. Once again, we relied on the RN providing an exchange officer at the submarine base at Platypus in Sydney until the mid-90s. The focus was predominantly more on rescue, on escape rather than rescue until, but it expanded a lot when we opened the submarine escape training facility at Stirling in the 1980s. Which is one of only 7 worldwide and the only one in the southern hemisphere when it was opened. We continue to conduct exercise Black Carillion every year to maintain our submarine escape and rescue capability, which has clearly a very major medical input. Meanwhile, we had our first medic submariners going to sea in 1999, and the reason we did that was to reduce the need for the submarines to land people ashore when they were doing operational things.
Mike, in the last episode we talked about the development of an RAN nursing service in the Second World War. How did that service fare after the Second World War?
Well, in 1948 it was decided to disband the uniform nursing service, although a small pool of civilians still remained, until 1964, and a shortage of medical sailors led to its re-establishment. And they had 2 roles: the care of patients in hospital, but importantly, supervising the training of medical sailors to make sure that they had the necessary expertise when they went to sea.
This one thing to remember though was that the Navy Nursing Service was actually established separately from the Navy in general, and separately from the Women's Royal Australian Naval Service. It was amalgamated together with the RANs in 1985, and that's the point where they became eligible for senior leadership positions within the health services, along with their medical, dental and medical admin colleagues.
Can you describe, Neil, the provision of shore-based health services for Navy personnel? We've talked a little about Manus Island and some of the other establishments. Can you talk a little bit further about the shore?
Well, we had the Navy ward at Prince of Wales Hospital, which had been going since the 1920s. That moved to Penguin in 1950. These and the Navy hospitals at Shorebased and Albatross were augmented by additional inpatient facilities at Narimba, Lewin and later Stirling. And we had outpatient sick bays at just about every other shore establishment until the 1990s. The inpatient capability at Penguin was transferred to St Vincent's Hospital in the early 2000s. It was closed in 2013. Albatross received a new facility in 1995, and that replaced a fibro-built building that originated during World War II as the Air Force NCO mess. The interwar and World War II facilities at Shorebased Hospital were replaced in 1996, and it's now home to the ADF Dental School.
In fact, you mentioned those replacements of shore facilities and those World War II pretty awful buildings. I had a bit of involvement in making sure that facilities like that were updated and lobbied to particularly improve the facilities at Shorebased, which was open passageways leading to brick and corrugated iron wards. We got one stage, I think we're number 6 in the list of Naval Works planning and priorities, but couldn't get past that until Minister Beazley visited Shorebased, and I got a phone call in the afternoon saying that this new replacement service hospital was moved to number 1. The result being that Minister Beazley had walked through one of these open passageways, and a pigeon strategically above him shat on him. I don't know who'd trained the pigeon, but it was a great success.
It's worth noting that the famous submarine photo of Cuttable being sunk alongside Garden Island, there's a white building in the background which was actually the dental facility for Cuttable, which remained in use until the 1990s.
So to wrap up this this little discussion about the Navy's services, what happened around 1997?
Well, we had a review in 97 which essentially resulted in the unification of the 3 uniformed health services. As I said, the closure of the operating theatre at Penguin led to a new Navy ward at St Vincent's from 2008 until 2013. 2008 review resulted in a series of service and regional level agreements between the service chiefs and the new commander of Joint Health Command. So health services ashore since then have been a Joint Health Command responsibility, which uses a combination of Navy, public servant and contracted civilian health providers.
Okay, to change tack a little now from the provision of the services to thinking about things like ship design. Mike, can you talk about medical involvement in ship design and seagoing medical facilities?
Yeah, I think in relation to ships built in Australia, I think there was largely little involvement. The early iterations of the British design, the Rothsay class frigates, which developed into our River class and the Leanders, we basically followed the Royal Navy, and as such we got well-equipped, spacious sick bays that were very good for our needs. When we moved to decide to build an Anzac class frigate in Australia, my assumption that there was no involvement. And in fact, at that time, the general principle seemed to be within Navy that once they'd adopted the design, that none of the directorates could have any input in it because there'd be no modifications to. Against that, I remember talking to Admiral Trelaw in the medical directorate and just asked him what were the sick bays of the Anzac frigates like, and he said, I don't know, but we're not involved. However, the project office was in the next building, and a friend of mine was down there, so I went down and asked to have a look at the plans for the sick bay of an Anzac ship. And he got the plans out, looked at it, looked at it again. There was no sick bay. The reason for that is that we'd adopted a Turkish modified design from the original German design, and the Turkish operating scenario, if they had a patient or sailor that required medical treatment, he would be landed at the nearest port, and they were operating in the Mediterranean. That was no problem. So hastily, 2 cabins were redesignated as a sick bay, and that's how, when the ships arrived, they did have a purpose-built sick bay.
Can you talk also about the development of the Navy's primary casualty receiving facilities aboard the LPAs?
Yeah, that was another project that I had a lot of personal interest in. I had developed a rough concept paper for what's determined a level 3 health facility afloat, and that means the ability to conduct surgical operations, particularly important to manage those after surgery and manage them in numbers. There'd been a belief, I think, amongst some of my seaman officers colleagues that we did have that in Melbourne and Stort. We had an operating theatre, yes we did, but if you did one operation, then that was the limit. It had no staff to monitor the post-recovery, and so a larger level 3, which was capabilities, that's what we got. I produced a staff paper about that. I don't know what happened to it, but it didn't gain much traction. However, in a later appointment to the Health Directorate, I had a bit more ability to influence things, and got a project officer dedicated full-time to develop that concept, and that was Commander Rush Shedlick. And over a year he produced very detailed requirements based on what he'd learned from overseas navies as well. And towards the end of the year, when we purchased the two surplus landing ships from the United States, renamed them Conimbla and Manura, and in their conversion we incorporated that level 3 capability.
And Neil, can you talk about how those facilities in the LSDs were used?
Well, they were both used for exercise casualties and for real patients for several exercises, in particular the Talisman Sabre series. I led the medical team for Talisman Sabre 2007, and well, the most striking thing I got was how the PCFs could actually be used to not land people ashore. It was very nice to sort of go, to be told, oh, we can actually keep this one on board, and go, okay, we'll keep going, which is great. They're also used to provide medical support for various operational taskings in the Southwest Pacific and East Timor. And Commodore also participated in the 2003 Gulf War. I think the main highlight, though, was when Commodore supported the humanitarian aid response to the 2004 Indonesian earthquake and tsunami. She deployed at very short notice over the Christmas leave period with a medical team that was intended to support the Army, engineer and other elements ashore, while also treating local civilians depending on spare capacity. She completed Sumatra Assist 1. She was in Singapore on her way home when she was redeployed to Sumatra Assist 2 after another earthquake hit near Nias Island. During which we lost 9 people killed, including 5 Navy and Air Force medics in the crash of Shark 02.
Now, moving on from that very sad note, Neil, can you talk a little bit about the non-high-end LPA level of health services and support to maritime operations? And in particular, can you describe why and how the Navy came up with the idea of clinical managers for major fleet units?
Thanks, Rob. The clinical managers, just to explain, are the senior medical sailors that run the ship's medical departments when there's no MO embarked on the major fleet units. The reason we did it was that up until then we'd used medical officers on all of our ships, but the end of the Vietnam War in 1972 led to a very difficult recruiting problem, which meant we couldn't do that anymore. So Nursing Officer Lieutenant Commander Sheena McDougall, Medical Admin Officer Lieutenant Commander Phil Davies, who had lots of sea time as a sailor, assisted by the then medical officers in charge, Jeff Bayliss, followed by Kerry Delaney at Cerberus, developed the Advanced Clinical Course, or ACC, in 1981. At the time, nothing like this course existed in Australia or elsewhere. It's very much a proto-paramedic course. Its benefits quickly became apparent when a sailor fell across a hatchway and ruptured his urethra. It took him 3 days to be landed ashore, while a commanding officer with a myocardial infarction likewise demonstrated the ACC's benefits in teaching very junior medical sailors how to take charge of such patients. The course was renamed the Phase 4 course in the mid-90s and became the current Clinical Managers course in the early and mid-2000s.
So thinking about some of the other maritime operations we've been involved with, Mike, can you talk a little bit about what happened during and after the 1990-1991 Gulf War?
Yeah, there are a number of challenges that the RAN was faced with the Gulf War, and particularly the possibility of having casualties from chemical and biological weapons that we knew Iraq did possess. In fact, they'd used them on their own people. So with the sudden commitment of Australian naval forces to the Gulf, how were we able to cope with this threat? I'm not quite sure who within Navy had made a decision some years before to develop that capability where there was medical expertise in the treatment of chemical and biological weapons. I don't think that capability was really appreciated at the higher levels, and I can expand on that. When I was at a CNS Heads of Divisions meeting, and I was trying to think of something of interest to say, and as it turned to me, as the last speaker, then CNS asked, "What's happening in the health world?" And I said, "Well, Captain Delaney has just recently come back from the United States doing refresher training in chemical and biological warfare," and I thought that would get a few tick in the box, but instead I was quite shocked when Admiral Hudson picked up a large pile of papers in his desk, threw them on the floor and said, "Why are we bothering with this? We're never going to have any need in our Navy to have such expertise." Well, within 8 months, his successor was being advised about what precautions his sailors should take in that theatre of operations in the Gulf.
So even Chiefs of Naval Staff, CNSs, are not prescient as to all of the health threats we're going to face. Mike, were those weapons used?
As it happened, there's no evidence that they were used either on land or at sea. There were sightings of silkworm missiles overflying some ships in the Gulf. Whether they were weaponised or not, no one knew. But it was still a threat. It was a real threat, and sailors were concerned that they may be hit by weapons such as these. Yeah.
Were any Navy Health Services personnel involved in the UN Special Commission that followed after that war dealing with these stockpiles?
Yeah, once it was recognised that Australia, and particularly that the Navy, had that expertise in the medical aspects of chemical and biological weapons, we contributed to identification teams under the auspices of the United Nations Special Commission, and the first team with Commander John Parks and Chief Dowell Dilger were part of a team that went in 1961. Later,
1991.
1991?
Yes.
Later, Commander Andy Robertson, with similar training experience, was deployed to Baghdad as Chief Inspector of a UNSCOM team, and in 1997 he represented Australia at a meeting in the UN which concluded that there was then no complete record of Iraq's biological warfare production. Certainly weaponised systems had been found and destroyed.
And Mike, just to wrap up talking about the 1991 Gulf War, were there any other health support issues or challenges during that conflict?
The big one was the attachment of ADF health teams, initially predominantly Navy, but later combined with the three services, that contributed to the United States naval hospital ship Comfort. The United States had 2,000-bed hospital ships that went to the Gulf. Mercy was kept in reserve in Bahrain, but Comfort was offshore, in fact headed right up into the Gulf when the initial land invasion commenced. It was an interesting exercise because Navy was very keen to make sure that we had an arrangement whereby if we did suffer casualties that they could be managed by a sophisticated health system, and we didn't have that in theatre. So by making a contribution to the United States Navy, it ensured that we had access to their evacuation chain. There were some challenges in that, that the United States Navy was a bit wary of having non-US people with health qualifications that they may not have recognised, and they'd gone through some recent experiences in their hospital Bethesda, which had deficiencies there. So the initial idea was that we could have an Australian team on board, but would only treat Australian casualties. In the end, sense prevailed once in theatre, and the expertise that we did provide to the comfort was acknowledged, and we provided unique expertise that they didn't have.
What sorts of expertise were they, for example?
Well, one small but vital expertise, where we had a nursing officer in the Navy who had recent experience in the management of burns, and when the USS Iwo Jima suffered a boiler explosion with some sailors seriously burnt, within the large USN hospital ship, they had no staff with recent management of burns. And so we were able to provide that. Unfortunately, those sailors didn't survive, but they were nursed for 4 or 5 days with up-to-date nursing treatment.
Neil, can you describe what's happened with Navy's seagoing surgical capabilities since the 1991 Gulf War?
Well, I think probably the main one basically relates to the transition from the primary casualty receiving facilities aboard the the LPAs to those aboard the LHDs, because the LHDs had such a vastly expanded capability. There were some major challenges keeping it going in terms of people during the hiatus between the LPAs paying off and the LHDs entering service, trying to keep them properly and working out how to staff them, and also their store support. The staffing situation led to probably the other major change. For most of the LPA period, the staffing for when their PCRFs were activated was, we did have a group of people, but it was a bit sort of ad hoc. And one of the things we had to do was stand up a dedicated maritime operational health unit from 2014 in order to best capitalise on what the LHDs can do when their PCRFs are activated.
So could you just talk a little bit about what the LHDs do and why they have a PCRF?
Well,
what is an LHD?
Okay, well, the landing helicopter docks are the big shoebox-looking ships that came into service from 2015. They're amphibious warfare vessels, and they have a crew of about 400, but they also carry up to 1,000 embarked force personnel, which are usually Army. Amphibious operations are important in terms of health support because it's all got to be done from the ship until the Army can get itself sorted ashore. And to that end, we have a facility with 2 operating theatres and a 6-bed resus area and an 8-bed high dependency unit and wards for up to 50 beds for up to 50 people. So along with all the laboratory, X-ray and other facilities need to keep all that running.
So I assume that Canberra and Adelaide, our LHDs, therefore need quite an enhanced medical complement in order to manage this size of PCRF.
Certainly, it's more of a skills thing because you need laboratory people, you need X-ray people, but the biggest numbers changes to the numbers, I guess, relates to people to things like intensive care and general ward sort of staffing there. There's also need to acknowledge the extent to which the PCRFs need support from the rest of the ship with respect to things like moving casualties around, bed linen, laundry, sort of dumb things like that, but are really still essential. Absolutely. They're dumb, but they're essential. Absolutely. You can't function without.
Well, before we wrap up, I'd just like to ask a question about a very niche capability that Navy Health has, and that's to talk a little bit about forensics. Now, the reason I asked this is I was involved in the Commission of Inquiry into HMAS Sydney 2 and its sinking after its engagement with Cormoran. And one of the issues we looked at was the presence on Christmas Island of a single sailor who had washed up in a life raft who was buried on Christmas Island. And Navy played a role in a forensic role in trying to identify that sailor. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, well, the ADF had expertise in identification using dental records for some time, mainly a group captain in the Air Force Reserve. His role was taken over by Captain Matt Blinken that did a further study in that, and its capability that goes beyond just dental aspects, its DNA evidence, and his expertise, along with a few others, also used in the civilian sense, where they've been seconded to agencies such as after the Victorian bushfires and the tsunami in Aceh, a particular expertise that's very good to have in a military population because of the need to identify military casualties.
Well, that then brings us to the penultimate question, and that is, what does it all mean now?
Except I might just butt
Please
in
do.
for a minute, because there's one aspect that I think I'd forgotten about, is important, and that's our relationship with foreign navies.
Indeed.
And one in particular was our relationship with the Indonesian Navy. Now, in 1966, there was an approach from the Indonesian Navy for an exchange or share of ideas in dental treatment, and that seemed a bit strange. They had a very sophisticated postgraduate dental school in Jakarta, and they wanted to establish a link, and it was explained to me that it was sort of like soft diplomacy. They didn't want to involve an engagement of the RAN in warlike activities, but sort of a soft health capability. It was helped by the then president, a personal friend, was a Navy dental officer, so that probably facilitated that. And that continued for a few years, and of course then we had East Timor. But when I was DG Navy in the 90s, I remember being summoned by Admiral McDougall, and he said he'd just come back from the Indonesian ambassador, and out of the blue was a request that we establish health links with the Western Fleet. So a week later, I was in Surabaya, and that whole relationship was extended. And again, it was explained to me that it was, again, a little avenue into developing relations, but it was not at the sort of high-end capability.
And I assume, Neil, I'll ask you this, I assume we also have similar sorts of relations with other naval, medical and dental services around the world, even Five Eyes, etc., that we operate with?
Perhaps not as much as we used to. We have an exchange program for our medical admin officers with the US, and we also have aviation medicine training with the UK, as we mentioned previously. Probably the biggest one, as far as this stuff's concerned, relates to the submarine escape and rescue capabilities, which is actually quite a big deal. We've had a couple of Black Caribbeans have actually had quite a lot of international engagement.
And I'd add to that, little known, but there are periods in recent years where we contributed to UN missions as part of an ADF contribution, and I'm sure that a young dental undergraduate, when he was recruited into the Navy, would never have imagined that he would end up as a dental officer in the middle of Africa as part of an ADF contribution to Rwanda, probably the furthest away from the seaboard you could ever get.
There's actually been quite a few of those sort of tri-service engagements which have involved Navy health personnel.
Well, Neil, Mike, any further thoughts, final thoughts to wrap up this podcast?
Yeah, I think we talked about challenges faced over the last 100 years, and I explained earlier that some of those challenges are just as relevant in today's sophisticated Navy, where we have ships operating away from Australia in peacetime, and a ship, as you know, could be an airfield with fuel dump, aviation fuel, diesel fuel, armament stores, all in a potential situation where a medical emergency can happen. And you can't just rely on nearby civilian facilities, because even in the Southwest Pacific, those facilities don't exist, and they may be days away from where that ship is.
Neil?
I think Mike's raised some good points to that one. I guess the one from me is, there's two lessons. One is how Navy's health service functions and roles had to expand after World War II, in particular to accommodate Navy's operational capabilities that came up, in particular things like aviation, diving, submarine medicine, and CBRN defence, particularly because these are all very military specific. There's not a lot of demand for any of those capabilities in the civilian community, and what there is usually doesn't quite meet what we need. I think the same also applies to Navy seagoing surgical capability, noting that it's not just for treating bullet-riddled, bleeding battle casualties, but also supporting maritime humanitarian aid operations. I think the other challenges that Mike refers to pertains to how to keep this expertise going, despite the small size of our health services, particularly noting that borrowing expertise from bigger navies generally isn't a realistic option. And I think the increasing degree of specialisation of civilians, there's something like 80 specialisations in Australia, but spread between 100,000 doctors nationwide, and trying to spread that, or have that as much of that expertise as we need in-house is the challenges that we have now and will continue to have into the future.
Well, that's all we have time for. And Mike, Neil, it's been a great pleasure to have you join us today to share your expertise and your experience and your scholarship on the Naval Health Service. Our next podcast is on the Melbourne Voyager collision, and we look forward to you joining us then. Thank you.